Natascha Kampusch. The tragic story of Natascha Kampusch began on March 2, 1998, when she was kidnapped at the age of 10 while walking to school by Wolfgang Fritzl, who subsequently imprisoned her for 8.5 years in a cramped, soundproof, and windowless secret basement hidden beneath his garage in Shoaf, Austria. Throughout her long captivity, Natascha endured severe psychological abuse, chronic starvation due to extreme food deprivation, and total control by her captor, who forced her to act as a domestic slave by cooking and cleaning. However, amidst this suffering, she fought to maintain her sanity by educating herself through books, listening to the radio, and learning foreign languages. Although Fritzl instilled constant terror with threats of explosives and physical violence to prevent her from escaping, Natascha finally seized a moment of negligence on August 23, 2006, while she was cleaning his car and he became distracted by a phone call, allowing her to run through an unlocked gate and seek help from a neighbor until the police arrived to rescue her. Shortly after her escape, Fritzl chose to end his life by jumping in front of a train before the police could apprehend him, while Natascha, who was found pale and severely malnourished, had to navigate deep trauma and painful public conspiracy theories, eventually deciding to purchase the very house where she was held captive to ensure the building would not be exploited or turned into a macabre tourist attraction. Elizabeth Shoaf. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Shoaf in September 2006 in South Carolina is one of the most extraordinary survival stories, where a 14-year-old teenager was abducted by Vincent Filya, who posed as a police officer with false allegations regarding illegal drugs, then took her into the woods and held her captive inside a very cramped 15-foot deep underground bunker for 10 days of full suffering. Elizabeth Shoaf experienced severe physical and mental torture where her legs were chained to an iron pipe, a homemade bomb was placed around her neck as a death threat if she dared to escape, and she became a victim of repeated sexual abuse by Vincent Filya. Despite living in terror underground with makeshift facilities like a homemade toilet and a small TV, she cleverly began to implement a psychological strategy by pretending to fall in love and acting obedient to manipulate the kidnapper's emotions to gain his trust. Through this charade, she successfully convinced Filya to release her chains, allowed her to go outside briefly to leave strands of hair on trees, and finally managed to borrow the perpetrator's cell phone under the pretext of playing games to send an emergency message containing her location coordinates to her mother regarding her hiding place. The situation turned critical when the police released the message, which appeared on the bunker's TV. This made Filya furious and he threatened to kill her. Elizabeth stayed remarkably calm, acting as his confidant and suggesting that he should run away immediately to avoid being caught. Filya believed her and fled the bunker alone, leaving her unsupervised. Until finally on the 10th day she summoned the courage to come out and scream until she was found by the police. This traumatic event ended with the capture of Vincent Filya, who was then sentenced to 421 years in prison until the perpetrator was eventually found dead behind bars in 2021. Colleen Stan. This tragic story tells the horrifying experience of Colleen Stan, who was kidnapped in 1977 by a married couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker, while she was hitchhiking to a friend's birthday party. For the next 7 years, Colleen lived a life that resembled a nightmare, imprisoned in a narrow wooden box beneath the couple's waterbed for 22 to 23 hours each day, while enduring brutal physical and sexual torture. To ensure Colleen would not dare to escape, Cameron carried out a meticulous psychological manipulation by creating a fictitious organization called The Company, which he claimed would kill Colleen's family if she tried to flee. During her captivity, in 1981, Cameron even took Colleen to visit her family in Riverside, introducing himself as her fiancé, Michael Powers. Although she was able to meet with her family and take photos with them in what appeared to be a normal situation, Colleen was too terrified to ask for help, believing she was constantly being watched by the fictitious organization. The turning point came in 1984 when Janice Hooker, feeling guilty as well as jealous because her husband was planning to make Colleen his second wife, finally confessed that the organization was a complete lie and helped Colleen escape to a bus terminal. Cameron Hooker was eventually arrested and sentenced to 104 years in prison, while Janice received legal immunity for her role in exposing the crime. Jan Broberg. This tragic story begins with the Broberg family's complete trust in Robert Berchtold, a friendly neighbor who turned out to be a manipulative predator hiding behind a facade of church activity. Robert used his social charm to undermine the family's moral foundation by having an affair with the mother, Mary Ann, as well as abusing and brainwashing the father, Bob Broberg. This extraordinary manipulation left Jan's parents psychologically blind, to the point where they allowed Robert to sleep beside Jan under the guise of a deeply manipulative therapy. The situation reached its peak in 1974 when Robert kidnapped 12-year-old Jan to Mexico, where he brainwashed the young girl using fake alien voice recordings and threats to kill her family, coercing Jan into agreeing to bear his child as part of a mission to save the planet. Although she was briefly found by the FBI, Berchtold's influence was so strong that Jan's parents dropped the charges, which later gave Robert an opportunity to kidnap Jan again in 1976, hiding her in a boarding school in California for 4 months. After the FBI rescued Jan for the second time and the family finally realized the horror of what had happened, Robert spent brief periods in a psychiatric hospital and prison before continuing to seek out other children as victims. Eventually, Jan revealed the full truth through her book, Stolen Innocence, in 2003, which left Robert Berchtold feeling cornered and led him to commit suicide in 2005 before the law could catch up with him again. Elizabeth Fritzl. The tragic story of Elizabeth Fritzl began in 1984 when she was lured by her own father, Joseph Fritzl, into a secret basement beneath their home in Austria, where she was then imprisoned for 24 years without a trace of sunlight. During this inhuman captivity, Elizabeth endured constant physical abuse and by her father, eventually giving birth to 7 children in the cramped space. Of these, 3 were taken upstairs to be raised by Joseph and his wife under a fabricated story of foundlings, while 3 others remained underground with Elizabeth, and 1 infant died shortly after birth. To ensure her submission, Joseph frequently threatened to kill Elizabeth and her children with poisonous gas if they ever made noise or attempted to escape from the bunker. In addition to the immense psychological pressure, Elizabeth was often left to starve in total darkness for days as punishment whenever Joseph was dissatisfied or angered by the children's behavior underground. This dark secret was finally uncovered in 2008 when the eldest child, Kirsten, fell seriously ill and required medical care, which ultimately raised suspicion at the hospital and prompted police involvement, leading Elizabeth to make a truthful confession under the condition of full protection so she would never have to face her father again. This resulted in Joseph's arrest and a life sentence, while Elizabeth and her children were given new identities to begin a life far from the trauma of their past. Suzanne Sevakis. This is one of the most complicated kidnapping cases. Began with the 1990 hit-and-run death of a woman named Tanya Hughes in Oklahoma, but the investigation quickly spiraled when it turned out her identity was a total fake that had been stolen from the headstone of a deceased child in a graveyard, and her husband, who was using the name Clarence Marcus Hughes, was actually a dangerous fugitive whose real name was Franklin Delano Floyd, who ended up kidnapping and murdering Michael, a boy he claims to be his son. Through a massive FBI probe spanning decades and testimony from her old high school friends, the truth finally came out that the woman known as Tanya was actually Sharon Marshall, a straight-A student who had spent years being abused, forced to work as a stripper, and eventually married off to Floyd, the very man who had been posing as her father. The situation got even more intense when it was revealed that Floyd systematically cut Sharon off from her past, even cruelly forcing her to give birth 3 times and give the babies up for adoption just to keep total control over her life. The tension hit a breaking point when police found horrific photos of sadistic torture in Floyd's pickup truck that linked him to the murder of Cheryl Camesso, who was another stripper that had the guts to stand up to his insane obsession. In the middle of the courtroom, things got incredibly emotional when Sharon's friend, Jenny, blew the lid off a dark secret about how Floyd gave sexy lingerie to his own daughter right in front of her, proving Sharon's entire life was just a sick game played by a power-hungry predator. For decades, Floyd had successfully stayed off the grid by hiding behind a maze of stolen identities, using fake names stolen from graveyard like Warren Judson Marshall, Brandon Cleo Williams, Trenton Davis, Preston Morgan, and even going by the nickname Kingfish to move Sharon around the country undetected. Sharon's real identity was finally uncovered as Suzanne Sevakis, who was a girl Floyd had snatched from her biological mother as a child and forced to live under a string of fake names until the day she died, leading to her grave finally being fixed with her birth name in 2017 after the whole bitter truth was finally brought to light. He was sentenced to death in 2002 for the murder of Camesso and was imprisoned at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, and he died of natural causes after spending over 20 years on Florida's death row.